The flash of a dozen smartphone screens was colder than the Seoul winter air. Sloane Van Doren stood at the center of the Elysium Pavilion, her laughter amplified by the live broadcast reaching thousands. In front of her, Elara Vance looked like a ghost haunting her own life, trembling as she clutched a bouquet of ashen lilies, brittle gray blooms that looked like they had been plucked from a grave. "Look at her," Sloane sneered into her gold-cased phone. The basement girl actually thought someone would send her real flowers. Even the dirt rejected these. This is the story of Xavier Thorne and the woman the world tried to forget. Subscribe to Alfred Mafia Stories for more drama series stories every week. Now the full story. Just as Sloane reached out to crush a petal, the neon violet arches of the pavilion flickered. A low, rhythmic thrum shook the pavement, not thunder, but the synchronized roar of 3 Wraith-class phantoms. The crowd parted in a wave of sudden, suffocating terror as the matte-black armored vehicles drifted to a halt, boxing the pavilion in. From the lead car stepped a shadow-given human form, Xavier Thorne. The sovereign of the Vanguard Syndicate didn't look at the socialites or the cameras. His midnight sea eyes were locked on Elara. He walked through the silence, knelt on the freezing stone, and took the gray lilies from her hands, letting them shatter on the floor. "7 years is too long to wait for a dance, Elara," he whispered, loud enough for every microphone to catch. He slid the midnight eye, a ring of pulsing starglass, onto her finger. "The world laughed at your gift. Now, let them bow to my wife." The fluorescent lights of the crypt of records hummed with a low, taunting vibration, a sound Elara Vance had come to associate with the burial of her own soul. Deep beneath the sleek glass and steel surface of Aurelian Holdings, the air was thin, recycled, and tasted of dust and stagnant ink. Here, Elara was not a person. She was a ghost, a nameless archivist tasked with burying the financial sins of the elite into paper graves. It was Valentine's Day, but the only red in the basement was the glowing error light on her ancient scanner. On her desk sat the ashen lilies, a bundle of gray, preserved flowers she had bought for herself with the last of her savings. A small, desperate rebellion against the crushing grayness of her life. The heavy steel doors hissed open. Sloane Van Doren walked in, her silver cocktail dress clashing violently with the industrial shelves. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was the CEO's niece, a creature of sunlight and silk. "So this is where you hide," Sloane said, her voice dripping with artificial pity. She picked up the lilies, her manicured fingers twisting the brittle stems. "I heard a rumor the basement ghost was waiting for a secret admirer." "How pathetic." With a sharp snap, Sloane crushed the gray petals over Elara's keyboard. The dust settled like ash over years of meticulous work. "Work through the night, Elara. The Obsidian Gala doesn't need ghosts like you haunting the punch bowl." As the doors closed, Elara stared at the ruins of her flowers. For 7 years, she had been invisible. For 7 years, she had carried the weight of a secret she thought the world had forgotten. The night she had pulled a dying man from a rain-slicked alley and wrapped his wounds in her own scarf. She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a heavy, gold-embossed card. It was an invitation to the Elysium Pavilion, intercepted from the trash weeks ago. She looked at the gray dust on her hands, then at the elevator that led to the world above. The ghost was done hiding. That night, the pavilion was a sea of violet neon and cruel laughter. When Elara appeared in her void silk gown, the mockery was instant. Sloane stepped forward, smartphone raised like a weapon, ready to broadcast Elara's humiliation to the world. "Look at her!" Sloane shrieked to her live stream. The ghost found a dress. But the laughter died in an instant. The air grew heavy, charged with the sudden arrival of the Wraith-class phantoms. When Xavier Thorne stepped out, the city's elite realized they weren't the predators, they were the prey. He didn't just claim Elara, he erased her past with a single sentence. As he slid the midnight eye onto her finger, the basement girl died, and the Sovereign's queen was born. The heavy doors of the Wraith-class phantoms sealed with a pressurized hiss, instantly deleting the frantic noise of the Elysium Pavilion. Inside, the cabin was a sanctuary of dark alcantara and rhythmic fiber-optic pulses that mimicked a resting heartbeat. Xavier Thorne sat across from Elara, his silhouette cutting a jagged line against the neon-streaked windows of the speeding vehicle. For a moment, the sovereign of the Vanguard Syndicate was silent, the predatory sharpness of his gaze softening into something closer to reverence. "You're trembling," he noted, his voice a low vibration that seemed to travel through the floorboards. "I spent 8 hours today crushing gray dust out of my keyboard," Elara whispered, staring at the midnight eye on her finger. The star glass seemed to hold a galaxy within it, swirling with trapped light. "And now I'm in a car that costs more than the building I work in. Why me, Xavier? Why tonight?" Xavier reached into a hidden compartment in the dash. He didn't pull out a contract or a weapon. Instead, he produced a tattered, blood-stained yellow scarf. 2,555 days ago, a girl with no reason to be brave dragged a dying man behind a dumpster in the rain, Xavier said, his eyes finally meeting hers. "You didn't ask for my name. You didn't ask for a reward. You just stayed until the bleeding stopped. I told myself then that if I survived the night, I would build a world where no one could ever make you feel small again." He tapped a glass interface on the armrest. A GeoJSON-powered map flickered to life in the air between them, showing a pulsating red dot moving toward the highest point in the city, the monolith. "While you were filing ledgers in that crypt, I was dismantling the people who put you there. Every document you ever processed, every signature you forged for Sloane's father, I have them. They aren't just records, Elara. They're the nails in the Van Doren coffin." The phantom slowed as it entered the private subterranean lift of the monolith. As they rose toward the 100th floor, the city fell away, replaced by the sprawling, clinical beauty of Xavier's penthouse. When the elevator opened, Elara gasped. The center of the room wasn't a lounge or a bar. It was a reinforced glass vault, glowing under a singular, soft spotlight. Inside, suspended like a holy relic, was the tattered yellow umbrella she had lost 3 years ago on a rainy Tuesday. Next to it were copies of every ghost letter she had ever written to her deceased parents, retrieved from the shredders of Aurelian Holdings and meticulously pieced back together. "You were never a ghost to me," Xavier whispered, standing behind her. "You were the only thing that was real." The doors of the monolith's private elevator didn't just open, they hissed like a predator claiming territory. As Elara stepped out onto the polished obsidian floors, the sheer scale of Xavier's world hit her. This wasn't just a home, it was a command center. "The gala was a public statement," Xavier said, his hand resting firmly on the small of her back, guiding her toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. "But this is the reality." Across the sprawling penthouse, a series of holographic displays flickered to life. Using a high-speed data pipeline, the system was pulling real-time feeds from every corner of the Elysium district. Elara saw herself on a dozen screens. Grainy CCTV footage from the basement, high-definition captures from the pavilion, and even thermal scans from the transit tunnels. "You've been watching me," she whispered, the realization chilling her blood. "All this time. I've been protecting the only asset that matters," Xavier corrected. He gestured to a secondary screen where a number PY-based analysis was running a predictive model on the Van Doren stock prices. The graph was a jagged cliff, plummeting into a red abyss. Sloane thought she was humiliating a clerk. She didn't realize she was insulting the future matriarch of the Vanguard. Elara walked toward the glass vault she had glimpsed earlier. Seeing her old, broken yellow umbrella preserved like a masterpiece felt surreal. It was proof that while she was drowning in the crypt of records, someone had been counting her breaths. Suddenly, a red alert flashed across the main console. A CNN-driven facial recognition sweep had picked up a breach at the monolith's perimeter. "Sloane," Elara breathed, seeing the socialite's frantic face on a security feed. Sloane was disheveled, her silver dress torn at the hem, screaming at the reinforced gates below. Xavier's expression turned to stone. "She wants mercy. She's come to the wrong spire." He turned to Elara, his eyes dark and expectant. "In the Vanguard, we don't just survive our enemies, Elara. We overwrite them. Tell me, do you want her silenced, or do you want her to watch as I take everything she ever loved?" The ghost in Elara's heart flickered, then died. She looked at the midnight eye on her finger, then back at the woman who had crushed her lilies. "I want her to work," Elara said, her voice finally steady. "Give her my old desk in the crypt. Let her see how long it takes for a Van Doren to become a ghost." The interior of the Wraith-class Phantom felt less like a vehicle and more like a confessional. As the city lights of the Elysium district blurred into long, neon streaks through the reinforced privacy glass, Xavier Thorne reached into the velvet-lined console. He didn't pull out a weapon or a ledger. He pulled out a small yellow piece of fabric, stiff with age and stained with the dark, rusted copper of old blood. 2,555 days, Xavier said, his voice dropping to a gravelly intimacy. 7 years to the hour. Elara stared at the yellow scarf. The memory hit her with the force of a physical blow, the freezing rain, the smell of iron and wet asphalt, and the terrifying weight of a man's body as she dragged him behind the industrial bins. "I thought you died," she whispered, her hand hovering over the fabric but not touching it. "I called for help, but when the sirens came, you were gone. I thought I'd imagined the whole thing. I couldn't stay. If the men hunting me had found us together, you would have been executed before you could even scream," Xavier replied. He leaned forward, the glow of the Phantom's LiDAR display casting a rhythmic blue pulse across his sharp features. "But I never stopped looking. While you were being erased in the crypt of records, I was rebuilding my empire from the ashes. I used every data pipeline I possessed to track that scarf. I watched through every CCTV camera in the city as you walked to work, as you bought those lilies, as you grew thinner under the weight of the Van Doren's greed." He took her hand, the midnight eye ring catching the blue light. "People think the Vanguard Syndicate is built on fear. They're wrong. It's built on a debt. You bought my life with a piece of cheap wool and 10 minutes of mercy. Tonight, the interest on that debt comes due." Elara looked out the window. They were ascending the private ramp of the monolith. The sprawling city below looked like a circuit board, and for the first time, she realized she wasn't just a component in the machine. She was the one holding the power switch. "Why wait 7 years?" she asked. "Because I didn't just want to save you, Elara," Xavier said as the car came to a silent halt. "I wanted to make sure that when I brought you to the top, there was no one left below who could ever reach up and pull you back down." The door hissed open. The vigil was over. The rain was beginning. The doors to the monolith's primary vault didn't slide. They retracted into the floor with a heavy, pressurized thud that vibrated in Elara's chest. Stepping inside, she expected a room filled with gold or high-tech weaponry. Instead, she found a museum dedicated to her own invisibility. The room was a cathedral of black marble, illuminated by soft, recessed spotlights that focused on glass plinths spaced perfectly apart. "This is the Spire of Silence," Xavier said, his footsteps echoing against the stone. "Everything the world tried to throw away, I recovered. I didn't just want to watch you, Elara. I wanted to preserve you." Elara walked to the first plinth. Behind the glass sat a tattered yellow umbrella, its handle scratched and its fabric faded. "I lost this on the subway 3 years ago," she whispered. "The wind took it. I had a Wraith-class Phantom track the transit line for 6 miles to retrieve it from a drainage grate," Xavier replied, his voice devoid of irony. She moved to the next display. It wasn't an object, but a series of high-resolution digital frames. They were CNN-processed images of her ghost letters, the private notes she had written to her late parents and fed into the office shredder at Aurelian Holdings. The AI had reconstructed the strips of paper, piece by piece, until her deepest thoughts were laid bare in glowing white text. Further in, she saw a row of black-bound ledgers. These were the crypt records she had filed under duress, the ones Sloane had used to hide the family's laundering schemes. But here, they were marked with red ink, every forged signature analyzed and cross-referenced with number PY arrays to prove her innocence and their guilt. "You turned my misery into a forensic archive," Elara said, her breath hitching. "I turned your misery into evidence," Xavier corrected. He led her to the final pedestal at the very center of the room. It was empty, save for a small velvet cushion. "The Van Dorens treated you like a ghost because it was convenient for their crimes. But in this spire, you are the only truth that exists." He stood behind her, his reflection caught in the glass alongside hers. the basement ghost, and the sovereign. Tomorrow, the world learns that the woman they mocked is the one who holds their keys. But tonight, he leaned in, his voice a shadow against her ear, tonight is for the girl who stayed in the rain. Elara looked at the empty cushion, then at the midnight eye on her hand. She realized the empty space wasn't for an object, it was for the woman she was about to become. The walls of the penthouse didn't just display the city, they became a weapon. With a single gesture from Xavier, the minimalist black marble of the monolith transformed into the architect of ruined command center. Dozens of holographic screens ignited in the air, a glowing blue and gold forest of data. Using a massive data pipeline, the system was feeding directly into the global stock exchange and the city's criminal justice databases. "Watch," Xavier commanded, his voice cold. "This is how a dynasty ends." Elara saw Sloane Van Doren's face on a central screen. She was no longer the poised socialite from the pavilion. She was in a police precinct lobby, her silver dress stained, screaming at officers who refused to look her in the eye. Below her face, a number PY-calculated ticker showed the Van Doren family net worth. It wasn't just dropping, it was evaporating. "I used a classification algorithm to tag every fraudulent transaction they ever forced you to log," Xavier explained, pointing to a stream of red-coded data. "The moment I slid that ring onto your finger, the system triggered a global sell order on every asset they own. By dawn, the name Van Doren will be synonymous with bankruptcy." Elara watched as a live feed showed the Elysium Pavilion being cordoned off by federal agents. The very arches where she had been mocked were now being stripped of their gold leaf. "They used your ghost letters to frame you for their laundering," Xavier said, his eyes fixed on the screens. "So I used their own encryption to reveal the truth. I didn't just destroy them, Elara. I made them pay for every hour you spent in that basement." Suddenly, the elevator chimed. The doors opened to reveal a broken Sloane Van Doren, who had bypassed security using a legacy code Xavier had intentionally left active. She fell to her knees, her forehead touching the obsidian floor. "Please," Sloane sobbed, not looking at Xavier, but at Elara's feet. "Stop the liquidation. My father. He'll kill himself. I'll do anything. I'll be the ghost. Just stop it." Elara looked down at the woman who had crushed her lilies only hours ago. She felt the weight of the midnight eye, its star-glass pulsing with a cold, absolute power. She looked at Xavier, who stood like a statue of shadow, waiting for her command. "The basement is empty, Sloane," Elara said, her voice echoing through the spire. "But the records still need to be filed. Xavier, give her the ledger. Let her see if she can survive the dark as well as I did." Xavier's mouth twisted into a ghost of a smile. The ruin was complete. The transition from the clinical luxury of the monolith to the Aurelian shipyards was a descent into a different kind of darkness. The air here didn't smell of recycled oxygen and expensive Alcantara. It tasted of salt, diesel, and the looming threat of a storm. Rain lashed against the windshield of the Wraith-class Phantom as it pulled into a circle of 4 other black SUVs, their high beams creating a blinding arena in the center of the industrial lot. "The Van Dorens provided the motive," Xavier said, stepping out of the car and opening the door for Elara. "But this man provided the blade." In the center of the light stood Marcus Vane, Elara's former manager at Aurelian Holdings. He was the man who had assigned her to the basement, the one who had hand-delivered the forged ledgers for her to verify under the threat of termination. Now, he was zip-tied to a rusted shipping container, his breathing ragged. Xavier handed Elara a tablet. On it was a complex decision tree visualization, a map of every command Vane had ever issued. "Using L2 regularization on the Syndicate's forensic servers, we filtered out the noise of the corporate structure," Xavier explained, his voice cutting through the rain. "What remained was a direct line of culpability. He didn't just hide the money. He used your login credentials to create a digital paper trail that ended at your desk. If I hadn't intervened tonight, the federal warrants would have been in your name by morning." Vane looked up, squinting through the rain at Elara. "It was just business, Vance. You were a ghost. Nobody was supposed to care what happened to you." Xavier stepped into the light, his presence instantly silencing the man's protests. He placed a heavy, gloved hand on Elara's shoulder. The world is full of men who think they can hide behind business. They forget that every ledger has a final entry. He looked at Elara, offering her a choice. The shipyard is outside the city's jurisdiction. I can hand him over to the authorities with the evidence we've gathered, or I can let the syndicate handle his severance package. Elara looked at Vane, then at the tablet showing the cold, calculated logic of her own framed life. She felt the weight of the starglass ring, a reminder of the power she now commanded. "Give the evidence to the authorities," Elara said, her voice like ice. "But make sure he's processed in the same precinct where the Van Dorens are being held. I want him to see exactly whose empire he helped destroy." The calm of the shipyard was shattered not by thunder, but by the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of high-velocity rounds impacting the Phantom's reinforced hull. "Get down," Xavier commanded, his voice a low growl of pure instinct. Before Elara could blink, he had lunged across the cabin, his massive frame pinning her against the floorboards as a specialized thermite charge detonated against the driver's side window. The world turned into a kaleidoscope of shattering glass and orange heat. They were moving. The Phantom's autonomous navigation system had detected the breach and initiated an emergency extraction, hurtling the heavy vehicle into the narrow, concrete confines of the Elysium transit tunnel. "Who are they?" Elara gasped, her face pressed against the cool Alcantara as the car swerved violently to avoid a black-clad motorcyclist. "The architects of ruin don't like it when their tools are stolen," Xavier replied, his eyes fixed on a small holographic tactical display. "The Van Dorens weren't the only ones using your basement to hide money. You're a living database, Elara. To them, you're a breach that needs to be plugged." Using a convolutional neural network, CNN, integrated into the car's external cameras, the system identified the attacker's heat signatures through the smoke. Xavier reached for a hidden panel, drawing a suppressed weapon, but he never let go of Elara. He was a shield of bespoke onyx weave and raw muscle. "I'm the Sovereign's weakness," Elara realized, the weight of the starglass ring feeling heavier than ever. "No," Xavier countered, his gaze hardening as the car's defense system deployed a cloud of electromagnetic chaff to blind the pursuer's sensors. "You are the only thing that makes the Sovereign worth being. Hold on." With a sudden, violent lurch, the Phantom surged forward, its engine screaming as it broke through the final line of attackers. The tunnel fell behind them, replaced by the dark, winding road that led toward the coast. Xavier finally sat back, his breathing steadying, though he kept his hand firmly locked over hers. "The city isn't safe for you tonight," he whispered, looking at a small cut on his cheek where a glass shard had grazed him. "We're going to the Apex Sanctuary. It's time you saw the man behind the monolith." The Apex Sanctuary was a fortress of glass and weathered stone perched precariously over the crashing black waves of the northern sea. Inside, the roar of the ocean was replaced by a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. Xavier led Elara to a room at the very edge of the cliff, where the walls were lined not with screens or weapons, but with thousands of narrow wooden cubbies. On a heavy oak desk in the center of the room sat a single, flickering candle and a fountain pen. "You found my letters in the vault," Xavier said, his voice barely audible over the distant surf. "But those were the ones you wrote to the dead. These are the ones I wrote to the living." Elara walked to the desk. Hundreds of envelopes, cream-colored and heavy, were stacked in neat chronological order. She picked one up. It was dated 4 years ago. May 14th. "You wore a yellow ribbon today. You looked like the sun in a tomb. I almost walked into the lobby just to say your name, but the architect's men were watching the perimeter. To love you is to keep you in the dark. I hate the dark." Elara's breath hitched as she realized the sheer scale of his vigil. These weren't just reports from a private investigator. They were the desperate musings of a man trapped in a world of violence, reaching out to the only light he knew. Using a natural language processing (NLP) model, Xavier had even mapped the sentiment of her own life. The letters were filed according to her moods, which he had tracked through her gait and the way she typed. "You were my anchor," Xavier whispered, standing in the shadows of the doorway. "Every time I had to do something monstrous to secure the syndicate, I would sit here and write to you. I told myself that if I could keep you safe, then there was still something in this city worth saving." Elara turned, the letter trembling in her hand. For 7 years, She had felt like a ghost, a glitch in the system. But in this room, she was the most documented, most cherished being on Earth. The letters weren't just paper. They were the derived learning of a man who had studied her soul to keep his own alive. "I'm not a ghost anymore, Xavier," she said, stepping toward him. "No," he replied, taking the letter from her hand and placing it back on the desk. "Tonight, the letters stop. Because tomorrow, the world hears your voice." The Obsidian Gala, exactly 1 year later, was no longer a stage for humiliation. It was a coronation. The crystalline arches of the Elysium Pavilion glowed with a refined, steady violet light, reflecting off the polished marble that had once been stained with the dust of gray lilies. As the heavy doors opened, a silence swept through the room that was far more profound than the mockery of the year before. Elara Vance stepped into the light, but the basement ghost was gone. In her place stood the Vanguard Queen, draped in a gown of pure white silk that seemed to radiate its own light, topped with a crown of rare starglass that matched the midnight eye on her finger. Beside her, Xavier Thorne moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had finally brought his world into balance. He didn't lead her. They walked as equals. In a dark corner near the service entrance, a woman in a drab, gray clerk's uniform paused while polishing a silver tray. Sloane Van Doren looked up, her face etched with the exhaustion of a year spent in the crypt of records. Her eyes met Elara's for a fleeting second. There was no spite left in Sloane, only the hollow realization of what she had thrown away. Elara didn't stop to gloat. Instead, she paused briefly, taking a single fresh white lily from a nearby vase and placing it on Sloane's empty tray. It was a gesture of superior mercy, the final entry in a ledger that had been balanced in blood and rewritten in devotion. "The dance, Elara?" Xavier asked, extending his hand as the orchestra began a low, sweeping melody. "Always," she replied. As they moved to the center of the pavilion, the city's elite bowed, not out of fear, but out of the recognition of a new era. The Vanguard Syndicate was no longer just a shadow in the night, it was a sanctuary. The 7-year vigil had ended, and the reign of the sovereign and his queen had just begun. In the underworld, they say a debt is a death sentence, but for Elara Vance, it was the key to a throne. Xavier Thorne didn't just burn down a dynasty. He built a sanctuary out of the ashes for the only woman who ever saw the man behind the monster. The moral of the night? Never mistake silence for weakness. The girl you crush today might be the one deciding your fate tomorrow from the top of the monolith. Movie camera, join the syndicate. If you enjoyed this high-stakes story, like this video if you believe in absolute loyalty. Subscribe to @Alfred Mafia Stories for more tales of power, obsession, and the dark side of devotion. Happy Valentine's Day to the family. Stay sharp, stay loyal, and remember, the Vanguard is always watching.